On va commencer. Donc, je vais vous accueillir en mon nom personnel, au nom de la chaire de recherche en fiscalité et en finances publiques à ce Midi-conférence où on a l'honneur de recevoir Kerry Harnish. I'll present you in French.
Sure,
It's
no
okay,
problem.
yeah, no problem. So, donc, Kerry, qui a passé une très grande partie de sa carrière à finance, puis où il a particulièrement élaboré de la politique d'impôt sur le revenu, et il a aussi rédigé des lois, donc il y a une expérience à cet égard-là. Il a été vérificateur en matière d'évitement fiscal, hein, donc il y a vraiment un intérêt pour l'évitement fiscal à l'Agence du revenu du Canada en Nouvelle-Écosse. Plus récemment, il y a aussi été conseiller national en matière d'évitement fiscal pour l'ARC. Il est diplômé de l'École de commerce St. Mary's et titulaire de diplôme en droit et de MBA de l'Université d'Alousie. Et il me disait aussi qu'il a fait une session à l'Université du Québec à Chicoutimi, donc dans son parcours. Exactement.
1979.
So, thank you very much, Kerry. Il va vous parler de tout son travail de recherche qu'il a fait sur l'évitement fiscal, une perspective historique assez unique, un regard unique sur l'évitement fiscal, puis comment tout ça a évolué à la Cour suprême. So, I leave it to you. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I don't have like PowerPoint or anything like that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to free flow on it based on certain things I want to say. And I've tried, what I'm going to try to do is do it for the audience. Many of you, actually the vast majority of your students, and you're taking a master's program. And unlike me, you're at the beginning of your career, at the end, if they say an old geezer. And one of the things I wanted to mention is that when I wrote the book, I thought in terms of, and I don't have this in the preface and I don't have it in the introduction, and I think it's important. I thought about what would I have wanted as a companion for when I took tax at law school. And this was back in 79 to 82. You get detailed books, you get tax, get the Income Tax Act or the Excise Tax Act. You get tax. All of these things are very precise. If you're not a student, they might want to put you to sleep. And you're at that stage in your life, you're looking at the rules and you're saying, well, what are the rules? And I got to know what the rules are to kind of continue my practice, or to begin my practice. And so that's what you're studying. You're studying the rules, and sometimes you'll have a paper, an essay that you'll do, and that gets you a little broader. But this book is trying to take you beyond the rules. And when I went to law school, and this is how the book to some extent came about, it was pre-charter. So our class graduated in 1982, the spring of 1982, and that was the year that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was enacted. So our class was the last class before that changeover. And the cases in tax that I studied at law school were of an older order, pre-82. So when I began working in tax in the 80s, and especially in the early 90s when I went to Ottawa, I was at CRA in Halifax for a while. But when I went to Ottawa, I started noticing these decisions coming out of the Supreme Court of Canada that had I couldn't relate to them because they were completely inconsistent with what I studied and what I had known to be the tax law at law school. And so that got me thinking. In the cases, I didn't quite agree with them, but I'm working, and it's hard to kind of do anything more. And over time, the decisions started becoming very formalistic, and that would have started around 94 with and Tosco, and then Friesen, and then it goes on to another case after case after case, and probably culminated in I think it was 80. Would have been 89. Was it Shell? Shell would have been 99. And so with Shell Canada, it culminated with this very formalistic approach. And what you find in these cases, and when you read these cases in your courses, you'll see statements in there about how the Duke of Westminster principle, which is a 1935 decision of the British House of Lords, is the way in which the courts generally interpret tax law. It's a textual approach, a strict interpretation approach. And that approach is inconsistent with the approach the court did before 1982. And that's what the book is pointing out. So when you read or you're told that the Canadian Supreme Court and the lower judiciary is supposed to follow what the Canadian Supreme Court does in tax cases, that their approach to interpreting the law is that they're supposed to take a textual approach. That's either, they call it plain meaning, strict, or literal, and that it's always been this way, and that it's a foundational principle of the law that the Duke of Westminster principle allows taxpayers to plan to minimize their tax liabilities. Well, there's a problem with that narrative, and the problem with the narrative is the Canadian Supreme Court of Canada never followed the principle until after the enactment of the Charter. So there's a myth out there of what's the approach to interpret tax law historically in Canada. And this is an interesting thing because also in 1935, the American Supreme Court, in a decision called Gregory, took the opposite approach to interpreting the statutory law of the United States. So we're in the United Kingdom and in the Commonwealth, the approach was said to be its legal substance would trump economic or business substance, very formalistic. Where in the United States, they say, no, economic business substance trumps legal form. These two decisions happen in the same year. The American decision, if I remember correctly, is 4 months before the British decision. So what's the response going to be of the Canadian Supreme Court? At the time, the Court of Appeal out of the Supreme Court of Canada on tax cases was to the Privy Council, which was a Commonwealth body that heard all appeals from the Commonwealth. And so you would think that the Supreme Court of Canada would be bound by precedent, the British precedent on this issue. Nevertheless, Canada existed within a North American context. Our culture certainly was evolving, and we have many influences in Canada that are driven by the American society. And also the Great Depression was happening at the same time in the United States and Canada, and was very intense in Canada. So with that in mind, I decided that, well, okay, I'm going to try to figure this out. I got to go back and read all the cases in order, try to put them in their historical context. So what I'm trying to do in the book is go well beyond the text and look at the context, not only of the tax context, but the societal context, be it economic, legal, or cultural. And you can't do that in every case, but I do it in certain cases that I judge to be very important in this. And so with that in mind, the next, I want to shift to the findings that I had in my research before I have a book. And this is, I try to condense it on one page. And so you will have this page, so you can kind of, but look, so what we have is we have the decision in 1935, but in 1938, the Canadian Supreme Court, in a 3-2 decision, expressly did not follow the Duke of Westminster. They indicated in the decision that the Canadian statute was somewhat differently worded, and that there's two decisions. There's a 2 for the Crown, 2 for the dissent for the taxpayer, and then there's a third judge who's Justice Kerwin, who decides to split by writing a separate decision in which he says something to the effect that the decisions of the British, he calls it the English courts, English judges, do not appear to be relevant in this case. What's the case? It's a corporate reorganization case. It's a case that concerns a very complex reorganization in which the assets of the company are moved to a new company. The assets are fully depreciated. In addition, the new company claims depreciation as if the cost base is, I don't have the exact number, but if you said the assets were $100 of undepreciated costs, they become $1,000, and they're going to depreciate the cost on these historic assets that are fully depreciated. And the minister at the time, under the old Income War Tax Act, had the discretion to deny claims in depletion, in depreciation, unreasonable expenses, artificial transactions, and he exercised his discretion to deny it. It was denied by the Supreme Court, so the minister's decision was upheld and was reversed by the Privy Council in London in 1939 on the basis that it was inconsistent with the Duke of Westminster principle. So the Supreme Court of Canada, you would think, has been told, start following the precedent, but that's not what it does. It never again says that the Duke of Westminster principle in an income tax case does not apply in Canada. What it does is it ignores the principle. And the statistics that I generated from this show that in 83% of income tax disputes that are of avoidance nature before the charter was enacted, the Crown was successful in 83% of those cases. So this is it's inconsistent with the narrative that the court has always followed the Duke of Westminster principle. It's not true. So what we do find, though, is that after the enactment of the charter, the statistics show that 73% of the cases are decided for the taxpayer in tax avoidance cases, citing with approval the Duke of Westminster principle and decision. So this is very odd occurrence, not only statistically, but in terms of precedent. So what did it do before 1984? Well, the court took in what I describe as a commercial substance and reality approach to the transactions that it sought to avoid tax. And when they looked at the text of the provision in those cases, they emphasized the object and spirit of the law that's in the text when interpreting the text. So they didn't just look at the literal meaning of the text. They said, what's the object of the text? What's the spirit of that text? And if it was a tax avoidance intent, they invariably denied the taxpayer the avoidance. A couple things that I point out in the book about this is that you have to bear in mind that these judges, they grew up in a culture and an economy and a society that is much different than today. The judges grew up, and many of them served in the First or Second World Wars. They've all experienced the hardships of the Great Depression, or their families, or people they know. These were dark days in Canada and also in the United States. And these judges, what I would say is, when they try to balance the rights of individuals against their obligations to society, they're erring on the side of ensuring that the obligations to society are respected, and that you cannot undertake, in the example of tax avoidance, artificial transactions that lack commercial substance or reality and be successful. But after the enactment of charter, what we have is the children and grandchildren of that society, that older society, coming into the mainstream, and they have different values, and they're emphasizing the individual rights and freedoms of people, and that culminates in Canada legalistically in the enactment of a Charter of Rights. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was the man behind that charter. It was very controversial at the time, which is not often mentioned. I can remember it very well in law school as it was being debated, the controversy related to it. And at the same time, and I will describe that emphasis on individual rights and freedoms, this is maybe, I don't think it's an overstatement, it's a leftist agenda that was met with resistance of a conservative society. And it was a leftist agenda that was successful with the enactment. But at the exact same time this was happening, our economy was in disarray. Unemployment was, 12%. Interest rates were 18 to 22%. Stagflation, energy was very expensive, gasoline. It was the 1970s, and it was economic dysfunction. And it culminated in the early 1980s with a rightist agenda of an economic nature. And that would be laissez-faire, and the representatives of that were Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, President Ronald Reagan in the United States, and Prime Minister Brian Mulroney in Canada. Well, you think in terms of that, you can see there's a consistency that's kind of unexpected. And what the consistency is, as rights and freedoms are in the ascent in the law, it doesn't take much to say, well, why in this context shouldn't the Duke of Westminster principle be in the ascent? It's about a person having the right to minimize their tax. So for whatever reason, that principle gets resurrected in Canada and becomes the principle that the Supreme Court says applies in Canada. And the result is the statistics and the decisions start reversing. And it culminates in 1984 at the beginning in a decision called Stuber Investments, 1984. So one of the outcomes of that was the older approach had constrained tax avoidance significantly. This Stuber investment decision and other factors resulted in tax avoidance going out of control in Canada. And so by 1988, the Mulroney government, through its finance minister, Michael Wilson, determined that they needed to enact a general anti-avoidance rule to contain the avoidance. But this avoidance only took off after 1984 and the Stuber decision. Before that, it had been constrained by the approach that the Supreme Court of Canada had been taking with tax disputes. So what the court has done, also interesting in my view, and this is my view, others would disagree with me, I think, but I think the court has interpreted the GAR very narrowly, and you'll on your own when you read the GAR decisions that are part of your courses, you can draw your own conclusions of whether or not they've interpreted. In the book, I explain where I think the court has interpreted the GAR narrowly, and the dysfunction that I see, and I call it dysfunction, is that before 1984, the approach taken was, in these tax avoidance cases, it was to look at the context and the object and spirit of the legislation, and not just its text. But we currently have an approach to statutory interpretation in Canada. So no. If it's a non-GAR case, we take a plain meaning, textual, literal approach. We're going to call it textual, contextual purpose, but we're going to kind of read down or minimize the contextual and purposive aspect. And in the decisions, you'll see them talking about, well, if it's such a detailed statute, and this is the approach that we should be taking in here. It wasn't taken before 1984. Only in the GAR cases will it take a true textual, contextual, and purpose approach. So the dysfunction is suddenly the GAR has been turned into a statutory rule of interpretation that allows the Supreme Court to actually look at the context, purpose, object, and spirit of the legislation. This is like, I don't understand it in the sense of precedent, in the sense of how we could reach such a dysfunctional result. And I'd point out, in the United Kingdom, they enacted a GAR several years after Canada enacted GAR. And when they enacted the GAR in the United Kingdom, they did it with the judiciary already applying the true contextual, contextual, and purpose approach. So in the United Kingdom, they look at the text, the context, and the purpose, and they give these concepts relevance when interpreting the statutory law. The reason that the United Kingdom enacted the GAR is they needed the GAR to address situations where, despite taking that approach, there's an artificial deduction or there's an abuse that goes well beyond that what anybody would think should be acceptable in income tax law, and that's what their GAR is for. But in Canada, if you read this, the decisions, and I'm very critical in analyzing this, somehow the court says we can only apply the general anti-avoidance rule if a particular rule, I'm going to use a word rule, has been misused or abused. So that means that if you abuse a scheme of the act, you're not going to be subject to the GAR unless it's a particular rule within that scheme. Well, if you go back to the pre-1972 Act, there were a whole bunch of specific anti-avoidance rules that address schemes. They didn't address abuses of a particular rule. They addressed abuses of schemes. The schemes that I'm talking about, the schemes to compute income, the specific anti-avoidance rule said you could not artificially unduly reduce your income. If you did, you were subject to reversal. There was another scheme that if you do corporate surplus stripping, removing the surplus of a corporation at no tax or as a capital gain, that too would be subject to reversal as an abuse. And then there's a scheme with respect to loss trading, corporate loss trading. So we do have a corporate loss trading decision that the Supreme Court have actually recognized that there was an abuse of. It's Matthews. But in Matthews, they say, well, you know, there was an abuse of a particular rule, therefore we're going to apply the GAR. What if there had been abuse of loss trading scheme, a transaction that abused the scheme, but the rule wasn't applicable? Suddenly that's okay. But interestingly enough, they're not okay under the old rules that were replaced by the GAR. And the old rules, they have in the explanatory notes, if you go to them, some of them are hard to find because the rules are so long repealed. They're repealed in 1988. But in these old explanatory notes, they say, well, it's expected that the GAR will fill in the abuse that was covered by these old rules. Well, the Supreme Court's approach is not doing that unless there's a particular rule so that's been abused. So that's kind of a funny result of the statutory interpretation, in my view. So I wanted to show you, though, just to show you statistically what I discovered and calculated. So let's look at this. This is kind of astounding. So Chief Justice Kirwan, Justice Abbott, Justice Martland, Justice Judson, and Chief Justice Cartwright. They are the first four I selected as the four of the 9 most important judges or influence in income tax law in the century that I covered, which was 1920 to 2019. Cartwright is an alternate. He's important, but he wasn't within the 4 that I identified. Just look at their statistics on tax avoidance cases on the right hand. So you go to the middle column, tax avoidance cases. It's a subset of all income tax cases. You go down the line, 92% Kirwan, 87% Abbott, 89% Martland, 90% Judson, 83% Cartwright. Those are very high statistics against tax avoidance. In all cases, their statistics aren't as dramatic, but they're still like eye-popping because we go Kirwan, 81% for the Crown, 87% for Abbott, 78% for Martin, Judson 82%, and Cartwright 62%. Now the Chief Justice I selected for this hypothetical panel is Justice Dixon. When I select these judges, what I'm doing in the book is I'm profiling what I consider their most important cases. So 6 to 8 of these cases will be written up. And in many of the cases, I put a lot of context around the cases, around the taxpayers and persons on the periphery. Those persons can include politicians. They can include very interesting historical events. And so, and also you needed a sense of what the economy is doing also at the time of these decisions. And the cultural influences that are going on in the society at the time. So Justice Dixon, so he is a veteran of the Second World War. He lost his leg in Normandy. in the war. He returned to Canada in 1944. He began an esteemed Supreme career after he was released from the Army in 1945 in Manitoba. He sat on the Manitoba Court of Queen's Bench. He sat on the Court of Appeal. He's a liberal justice. So that when I say liberal, what I mean is they are a little more activist than the conservative justice. So Kirwan, Chief Justice Kirwan, he's a conservative justice. He wants the legislature to do the heavy lifting on these societal norms, or as society's changing and evolving. Chief Justice Abbott, Justice Abbott, similar. Martland, a very conservative judge. Justice Judson, a very conservative judge. Justice Cartwright is a liberal judge. Justice Dixon is a liberal judge. If you look at these statistics, you'll see they're not as intense for the taxpayer. In the tax avoidance case, it's 64% instead of in the 80s and 90s. But if you look at Justice Dixon, his statistics are identical as Chief Justice Cartwright in normal tax cases, income tax cases. We switch now to the charter error. Justice Wilson, Bertha Wilson, appointed in 1982, 75% for the taxpayer. Justice Iacobucci, 81%. Justice Major, 88%. Justice Rothstein, 57%. And Justice McLaughlin, 78%. Now, her statistics have an anomaly in them that I discuss in the book, and I won't log down to get into that anomaly. But what I will mention is that before she became Chief Justice, I think it was in 2001, her statistics are heavily for the taxpayer. They're probably the most intense for the taxpayer of any judge after she became Chief Justice, it goes the other way, more for the Crown. Not statistically though, she's still for the taxpayer, but not as intensely for the Crown. So so you see these stats and you say, there's something going on here in these stats that need elaboration. And that's what the book's about, is trying to explain the stats, put them in the context of the culture, put them in the context of the cases, the disputes on the ground, in the rule. And then we see the overall approach for the court as a whole. So we see, let's go to tax avoidance. We see for the taxpayer overall before the charter, 70% of these income tax cases for the taxpayer, 83% for the Crown. We see charter error, 73% for the taxpayer. It's a flip. It's a flip. You can't say it any other way. It's a flip for the taxpayer. These are statistics at two opposite ends of a continuum. They need an explanation, and they also need to be put in a context that says, well, there's issues about being so far one way or so far the other way, but there's certainly no balance. You can say there's no balance in it. So, Chief Justice Patrick Kerwin, pioneer lawyer, he's the judge that decided to split on that case that I mentioned earlier. Very important judge. He's probably the most important judge in the Supreme Court of Canada up to the late 1950s. He decided a very interesting case, which was a corporate surplus stripping case called Emily Merritt. I spent a lot of time on Emily Merritt because of just the historic facts that are involved in the characters and the judges. It's a fascinating case. Justice Douglas Abbott. I want to spend a minute for Justice Doug. Justice Abbott is from Lennoxville. He attended Bishop's University. I don't have that in the book. He also has an honorary degree from this university. He was a minister of finance responsible for ensuring that it was in Parliament enacted the Income Tax Act of 1948. He had to marshal that through the Parliament, and he did it. He had previously been parliamentary secretary to the finance minister named J.L. Isley. He had practiced law in Montreal. He had gone to, I think, McGill, and he'd gone to a university in France, I think Lyon. I'm not 100% sure of that. But that's where he took his graduate degree. Anyway, there's a case here called British Columbia Electric Railway. Nobody reads it anymore. But I think it's an incredibly important case, and it's not a tax avoidance case. It's a case that concerns the computation of income. And when is an expenditure deductible and when is it not deductible? Abbott knew the rules because he was the guy making the policy decisions on the Income Tax Act of 1948. And much of that policy is still reflected in the current law. And this decision came out in 1958, and he gives the methodology that you're to use when you're looking at an expenditure and determining whether or not it's deductible or not. I'll leave the decision to you, but I want to make a couple comments on it because there's two things in it that, certainly one thing in it that I think we've strayed from and that needs to be revisited. In the decision, he says that when you're looking at an expenditure, first of all, and this is in the law, it's only deductible to the extent it was incurred for the purpose of gaining income. That's the first thing he says. It's coming out of the rule in the law. He then says, in a business context where you incur the expenditure, it's incurred in a business context, you can presume that it was incurred to earn or gain income. The word that's relevant there is presumed, because if it's shown not to be incurred for the purpose of earning income, it's that portion of it, only that portion of it is non-deductible. So the most common type of expenditure that many of you will see in your careers that doesn't meet the deduction criteria is something incurred for a personal purpose. And there's many situations where an expenditure will be incurred. The taxpayer may try to deduct it as a business expenditure where it was personal in nature. That personal, to the extent it's personal in nature, it's not deductible. Here's a question I asked in the book in a couple spots, including when looking at Canada Trustco, which is the first GAR case. How does an expenditure that is incurred solely for the purpose of avoiding tax survive that test? I have no idea. You won't see any discussion of this in the case law that I know of. So if you incur expense to avoid tax, how is that deductible? The presumption has not been met, in my view. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Hollinger North Shore, that concerns a mining case out of northern Quebec at Shefferville. It's a very interesting case, the background to it, and there's a lot in there, and I put all kinds of extra material in with that case. But by the way, the late Prime Minister Brian Mulroney ran the company. Well, he ran the operation there for several years in the 1960s. Anyway, let's go further. Ronald Martin from Alberta, a legal purist. He unlike the other judges, his law degree came from Oxford. He's not only a conservative judge, he's staunchly in the traditions of the British common law when he interprets its legislation. An interesting thing about Justice Ronald Martin, though, he does not follow the Duke of Westminster principle, which is precedent, which is supposedly what the Supreme Court of Canada is supposed to be following. Why is that? He does not follow the principle. I suggest in the book at the end of the chapter that I have on Justice Martin that he doesn't follow it because it's inconsistent with the Supreme Court of Canada's precedent. He's following the precedent, but he's following the Canadian precedent on this issue, not the British precedent. That probably, I just want to stop for a sec because the Deltona company the Deltona Corporation, it's just one of these cases that I had to put in because it's a sham case that nobody knows anything about. And so I had to put it in and it was decided less than a year after Cameron, which is a sham case. Cameron's the first case that you will see written up in the Supreme Court that I've seen anyway on sham in great detail. The taxpayer was successful in that case. The Deltona Corporation, you won't see anything on it because it's an oral decision from the bench, but it was a sham election undertaken by a taxpayer in a corporate surplus stripping sense when they're trying to move the assets of the company across the border into the United States. I went into the records. I have the oral decision in the book. I have the Exchequer Court decision in it, and it's very, in my view, the reason the election was not allowed by the court, they elected a certain treatment under the old 1952 Act that would have been no withholding tax on the dividend as it went across the border. There was a condition in the law that said that you could get this status if you were going to carry on a certain type of activity in Canada subject to Part 1 tax under the 1952 Act. When they did the reorganization to move the assets out of the company, it was all done within, I don't know, 20 minutes. So they made their election, they did this, they did that, and they wound the company up. So the Commissioner of National Revenue, well, like, you're not looking to carry on that activity. You did it all. This is like, it's all done within a compressed time period. And yeah, that's what happened. The election was not allowed, it was denied, and they were subject to tax. And they argued in the case that the Duke of Westminster principle applied. They also argued that the minister was reading it with words in the text that aren't in it, and that's, the Duke doesn't allow you to do that. And the Supreme Court, Justice Martin, dismissed it already from the bench based upon my recollection is that the reasons of the Exchequer Court were correct on the issue. And the factual difference is very important in my view. In James Cameron, Martin indicated that he was not prepared to find a sham because the tax avoidance intent was incidental to the overall plan, which was commercial in nature. In the Daldona corporations, there is no purpose other than tax avoidance for the election. So we have two cases within a year of each other with completely different taxpayer intent from an avoidance perspective. Justice Judson, he was born and raised in England, Northern England. He was from a working class background, and he emigrated to Toronto in the early 1920s. He was a teacher of Latin in high school. He eventually went back to law school in the 1920s and practiced beginning, I think it was in the 30s. Justice Judson is very interesting because the academics on the legal side refer to him as being a strict constructionist, somebody who goes to the text and construes the legislation based on the text. Well, guess what? He doesn't do that in income tax. Why? Well, we don't know why, but in income tax, he's probably one of the leading judges in the Supreme Court deciding cases based upon commercial substance always trumps legal form. And this Conn Smythe case is one of those cases. It's an incredibly interesting case. It's a corporate surplus stripping case, 1969. Conn Smythe, owner of the Toronto Maple Leafs, veteran of the First and Second World Wars, enlisted in both, maimed at Conn, a very leading person in Toronto from the time he bought the Toronto St. Pat's to the time he died. I think it was probably the 70s. Him and his co-owners are his son and Hap Day, who had been captain of the Toronto St. Pat's and the Toronto Maple Leafs in the 1930s. I spent a lot of time on that case, not only because it's interesting, but in the case, Justice Judson says, when you do the shuffle of the checks to avoid tax, you cannot avoid tax under this act by doing that. Shuffles the check don't count. And in the case, there was a sale. I won't get into all this complicated case. I won't get into all the details. But what they did is they moved the surplus out of the company out tax-free, got the business back, they had created the surplus, and they paid a facilitator a fee of $45,000 to do it. They moved over $2 million of value out of the company. And he said this shuffle of checks is not going to be recognized for income tax purposes. I'm going to pull forward a few decades, and I'll come back to that point. Justice John Cartwright, he decided certain pertinent cases. Dominion Taxi Cab, a short case, it's out of Montreal. He decided it on the basis of commercial substance over legal form. Many suggest it's legal substance that he decided the case as opposed to commercial substance, which is a wider concept. I indicate in the book why I believe it's commercial substance, and you can read it there if you want. Highway sawmills. What's interesting about that case is in highway sawmills, he's balancing your rights and obligations under the income tax law, and it's a case where they avoid recapturing excess depreciation deductions on the basis of that a timber resource property is not the land on the timber concession is not depreciable property. Anyway, he decides the case on the basis that the land is part of the concession, and that the sale of the land, which generated $22,000, was subject to income tax as a recapture of excess depreciation. So he makes it clear in the decision that if he hadn't done that, they would have been able to not only fully deduct all of the costs of the concession, but they would have had a windfall of the $22,000 of excess depreciation. And he says, no, your right is subject to your obligation to include it in income. Your right to deduct depreciation is subject to the obligation to include it into income, and that's how he decided the case. Now, he's also using precedent, and the other part of it is there's a dissent in this case. There's two conservative judges that agree with him, and there's also there's two liberal judges. There's another liberal judge that agrees. So it's a 2-2 split between the majority has two liberals judges and two conservative judges, but another of the conservative judges went in the dissent. And so he says it was okay what had happened here, and that the Crown would have had to enact a law to say the land was part of the concession for this purpose. Justice Dixon, I won't spend too much time on Justice Dixon, other than to say his leading decisions have been confined and outright overturned by the more recent Supreme Court in the 90 and subsequent era. And the decisions I'm talking about are William Medallion and Bronfman Trust. William Medallion is a farm loss case, and Bronfman Trust is an interest deductibility case, both overturned expressly by the Supreme Court. I talk about that in the book, but I set it up by just saying what Justice Dixon said. Let's go forward. Justice Bertha Wilson. Her precedent becomes the basis upon which the Supreme Court reverses tact and starts taking a formalistic approach. She is Scottish, born and raised and educated in Scotland. Although she emigrated to Canada with her husband, who was a minister, in 1949, and she ended up going to Dalhousie Law School and was a graduate in 1958 from Dalhousie Law School. She was at the start of the slow rise of women in the law profession, and she ended up at Osler in Toronto, and she became the head of their research department. In 1982, she was appointed to the Supreme Court. Her key decisions in this subsequent precedent are her minority opinion in Stubart Investments and her decision in Mattabi Mines. Her minority, you wouldn't have known at the time that her minority opinion in Stubart Investments would have been so important, because the majority opinion was by Justice Este. And what Justice Este is trying to do in the decision is try to balance this historic precedent, which he doesn't really refer to. He knows about it because he was on the court when some of this precedent was being formed. And he's trying to balance it with the Duke of Westminster principle. But I say in the book, it doesn't work, because how do you balance an object and spirit and context approach with the strict approach? They're inconsistent with this. I don't know how you balance them. And he put several guidelines that you could use to do it, but they never got taken up. Justice Wilson, in comparison, says simply the Duke of Westminster principle applies. Interestingly enough, in the decision, and she refers to nobody telling her in argument, written or oral, that Parliament had overruled the Duke of Westminster principle. So there's assumption by her, and also it seems by the litigants, that the Duke of Westminster principle had previously been applied by the Supreme Court of Canada in a income tax avoidance case, which is not true. It hadn't been previously applied. But the assumption in the decision is she's looking for a rule to overrule the principle that the court was not applying. Kind of bizarre. Matabi Mines, in Matabi Mines, it's a 7-member panel, if I remember correctly. Justice Estes on the panel. Prior to that, Imperial General and George Golden, these two judges, Justice Estes and Justice Wilson, are debating their respective approaches and not agreeing with each other. And what comes out of that is Matabi Mines. Justice Estes on the panel, but he's sick. And Justice Wilson writes the majority opinion, or the unanimous decision, I should say. And there's two judges that are ill, and they don't participate in the written decision. And Estes is one of them. And in that decision, she goes out of her way to point out that her approach is the approach that's correct, and that it's a strict, plain meaning approach. So we come to, I'll try to speed up here. We come to Justice Frank Iacobucci from British Columbia, taught law at the University of Toronto, practiced in the 1960s in New York. Justice Iacobucci is, I call him the key messenger. It's decision after decision, and they're generally going to take plain meaning approach to the text of the law, not a whole lot of context or purpose being relevant. And these decisions, though, interestingly enough, are like at Tosco, Duhau Printers, Newman, Ludco Enterprises, Brian Stewart, Jack Walls. These are decisions you may well read in the course of your studies. But the prior decision, that's I think is the key, is Symes. Symes is a nanny expense case. In the book, I speculate that the case was decided controversially, 7 male judges for the Crown and 2 female judges for the taxpayer, who was a lawyer in Toronto, who was deducting her nanny expenses against her business income. And the majority says, no, there's a scheme in the Act that allows childcare expenses, and you're trying to move the deductions over to the business side and not apply the limit on the expense that's deductible, and also the rule that says the lower income parent has to claim the deductions. While the female justices decided that no, that's not, it's okay that these deductions should be allowed, and in addition, they should earn charter rights. What I didn't mention is late 1992, there's a book called The Captive Court, written by a University of Windsor, Ontario law prof, who argues in the book, it's a very good book, it's a leftist agenda, that the Supreme Court of Canada has been captive not only to commercial interests, but also captive to British precedent, and that a new approach needs to be taken in which we need to enthuse into the statutory interpretation social values and charter values. And that's what this case is about. And the way that Justice Iacobucci prevents that from happening in the income tax law, this is my take on it, because he's never spoken on it other than his decision that I know of. No, there's a scheme in the Income Tax Act for child care expenses. It's not ambiguous, it's unambiguous, and this is the rules that you need to follow. So what they say is you cannot enthuse into the statutory interpretation these values, these societal values that you're trying to enthuse when the meaning is plain. And that, I suggest, is he's trying, the majority is trying to protect the Income Tax Act from an activist agenda, which is leftist. I would point out that this idea of enthusing social values into the statutory interpretation is a two-way street. You could take conservative social values and run the same arguments, but if you have a conservative panel, you might get those results. So these two-sided approaches to these values can be taken to extremes by a conservative or a liberal panel, but that doesn't come out as part of the decision. What comes out is, no, we're not going to do this. It's unambiguous. A couple months later at Tosco, and then the precedent starts coming out. Prior to that, though, in Slattery, he took an object and spirit and purpose approach in that Slattery decision. So that's why it's kind of interesting. It was 4 months before. The decisions keep coming forth. John Major, it's going to be plain meaning. He's from Ottawa, Ontario, but he practiced, and he went to Concordia. He practiced in Alberta, very top-end litigator. Justice Major and Iacobucci and McLaughlin, they're fairly close in their approach to income tax and its voice. He's co-wrote Canada Trust Code Matthew. I'm highly critical of Canada Trust Code in my book, and you'd have to write it up. But from my perspective, it's an artificial deduction that's being allowed. It's hard to understand how that deduction satisfied not only the Income Tax Act and the purpose test that's for every expenditure, but also the general anti-avoidance rule. I don't understand it. In fact, there was a 1966 decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in which the court said in a similar case, but not nearly as complicated, that if it didn't have to apply this technical reason why the plan didn't work, and it was also a leasing transaction like this one, we would have applied that specific anti-avoidance rule that says you cannot unduly reduce your income or with an artificial deduction. So that decision from 1960 is not cited. Furthermore, what's not cited in the decision is the explanatory note that says, when it was repealed, that old provision was repealed, that it's expected that the GAR will cover these scenarios. Anyway, Justice Rothstein, balanced statistics. He's probably the most balanced statistically of any of the judges. He's from Manitoba. He's no longer on the court. None of these judges, or most of them are deceased or no longer on the court. Copthorne Holdings, a GAR case. An important GAR case, a corporate surplus stripping case, cross-border, money being moved out of Canada tax-free without paying withholding taxes. The interesting thing to me about the case is that in the case, the Supreme Court said, citing Canada Trust Code, says that, and I'm going to simplify this, if you don't abuse or misuse a particular rule in the Income Tax Act, it doesn't matter if you abuse a scheme of corporate surplus stripping. Well, that was not the rule when it was a special anti-avoidance rule prior to the GAR. So I'm very critical of this approach. And in the Department of Finance, when they put out a call for papers on the amendments to the GAR that the government passed, I think last year, a former colleague of mine, Edward Short, and I wrote a submission to the Department of Finance, and we suggested that this was the most important thing, along with an economic substance test that needed to be put into the GAR. This was not done, and the economic substance test that was put in is deficient in my view, but you'd have to read the book.
We have like.
I'm done.
If you, you're done. Okay.
Well, that's it. I don't have anything else. That's it.
Questions from the
audience. No, sure. I want questions. Sure, if you have questions. No, it's a lot to take in. I'm taking into some of the details of some of the cases. I'm fascinated by the cases. In many of these cases, the facts in and around these cases are just astounding. Like we got dueling amendments by two governments in 1930s. The Conservative government of Prime Minister Bennett and the Conservative government of Prime Minister Mackenzie King, all about a corporate stripping rule, anti-avoidance rule, and nobody knows about the dueling amendments. And it's incredible that what was done in the lead up to it opened up a corporate surplus stripping for wealthy citizens. It was breweries, distilleries, and any other corporate business that made lots of money in the war and pennies was allowed to do a reorganization, which was a liquidation of the company during the Great Depression. The exact thing that you would never think the government would want to encourage during the Great Depression, the liquidation of a business. And we got unbelievable, it was Prime Minister Bennett that tried to stop it. Anyway, you have to read the book on that point. Anyway, but I come back to it in the epilogue, and I'll just say it. In the lead up to this current election, there are 2 years of incredible valuable tax benefits put out by the government and I discuss these benefits in the epilogue to the book. And these very valuable tax benefits that are going to high income and wealthy taxpayers, they come at a cost. And my concern, and one of my main concerns, and I'm going to get this on the table right here, is that I believe that this approach is making working class people and middle class people pay for the taxes that are being avoided under this approach. And I'm very concerned about it. I got a suit on today. I very rarely wear a suit. I decide I wear a suit. I come from a working class background. My father was a fisherman. My mother worked in a cafeteria in Halifax. I cannot believe that's going on in these cases. And I kind of go a little up to the epilogue, up to the conclusion. I keep it within the cases. I want the judges to say why they're saying this and why they're taking this approach. But in the conclusion and the epilogue, I shift into my views more so than what others are saying. And one of my views is our system is in crisis, absolute crisis, and the people at the top don't even understand it. Anyway, I'll give you the time to ask me questions because I want to take your questions.
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation. I'm very interested. I will read your book, but you mentioned about the view that judges had prior to the charter as to what is personal responsibility versus responsibility towards the society. And did you touch on the point of view, or do you have any view on how does general public view taxes? I mean, I was under the impression that taxes were always seen as some kind of a theft by the government, and there's this kind of a dissatisfaction of and it's okay not to pay taxes, and let's not make the queen any richer or the king any richer.
Yeah,
has that changed towards with time? Or?
I don't want to say. I think what I would say to you is the way you view taxes comes from your perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, I suggest that wealthy and high income people may feel hard done, that their success is viewed as a golden goose to pluck by others. Having said that, I also am concerned that if the legislature passes a law, the law needs to be respected and fought out in the legislature and in society as to whether or not it be changed. And I would also say that the approach that we take to tax avoidance is affected by where you come from, not just your whether you have the income, but also or the wealth, but also your background and your belief system. And society has changed. If you go back to before the 1980s, say the 70s, before the 70s, the difference in society between the wealthy and the lower end of the society was very, very marked. The 1950s and 60s, the post-war years, moved millions of Canadians and Americans into the middle class from the working class. And what we have going on now, say the last 10, 15, 20 years, is moving many of the middle class back into a lower income class. They might be middle class in general, but they don't have the purchasing power. The inflation's destroying their purchasing power. The tax, whether you're taxed too much from your perspective is, well, what are your taxes paying for? And the worst thing that destroys the public confidence in taxes is the waste, the absolute waste that can occur inside a government with respect to stuff. That destroys the confidence of society in the government. I don't know where we're at right now, but if you went into a tavern anywhere in this country, you would meet people that would say that the deck is stacked against them. I don't think there's too many judges going into a tavern. I've been in taverns. I've been in the legions. They think that the whole thing is stacked against them. And when you look at these stats, what does it tell you? What do these stats tell you? It tells you something that's going on that you didn't really know. Like, who knew this? Who knew I'm going back up, but who knew that the Supreme Court of Canada was deciding 73% of all income tax avoidance cases for taxpayers? You don't see that. You won't read that. You won't find that. Not even in the paper. I got a book out there. Nobody's even mentioning it. Wonder why. Next question.
Maybe quickly, it really seems like a drastic shift between pre-1982 and post-1982. And the narrative we learn is like, before the Court was really looking at the text, and the courts were pro-taxpayer, but I see it's not actually the case. And I'm curious about what's your opinion on what explains such a drastic shift between pre-82 and post-82?
It's hard to say, I know, and that's, people say this, but in looking at it all, what I think it is, it's the combination of the culture of the times, the historic upbringing of the judges, and the currents that are flowing socio and economically in the society. In the book, I suggested at the end, and I had to backtrack a bit on this, but I left it in. I suggested that by 2007-8, with the financial crisis, that things were shifting very slowly back to a commercial substance approach. It wasn't happening fast because I didn't mention, but prior to 1975, you got to the Supreme Court on a tax case by right. If it was $500 or more, you got there. Now you need leave. So the number of cases going to the Supreme Court are drastically reduced. When I say that, what I'm saying is the cases aren't going up. The precedent's being used in the lower courts, in the tax court, and in the federal court of appeal. And it's run on this narrative that's false. So I don't know what they do. Like, it's a myth. And busting a myth is very hard to do. And so I don't know if that answers it, but it's the culture. The baby boomers are the ones who came out of and were deciding these cases for the most part. The baby boomers. This is the generation that didn't fight in the war, didn't experience the generation. They reaped the benefits of the 1950s and the 60s and that post-war expansion, the opening up of universities so that people like I could go to the university. I would never went to university if it was in 1950s or even the 1960s. But by the 1970s, I could go to university. And there's many students in this university who are in the same position. So it's culture, it's societal. It's economics. And you got to bear in mind, these narratives are playing out in the literature. And the literature plays out a narrative that it's always been this way. There's no literature that says it wasn't this way except this book. And I recognize when you try to burst the myth, you got to be detailed. That's why I got stats. That's why I say what the judges say, and I keep my comments and when we're looking at these decisions to a minimum, because you got to read the decisions and form your own opinion. You're all big boys and girls.
Just one more question.
Yeah, I was wondering if you took some time to look at maybe if there was a shift in the United States, if they might have
that I don't know.
Shift while applying the commercial substance approach.
Did I take time? No. But let me say this about that. The American judiciary, for decades, since the 30s, as far as I understand, and I don't know all that much about the British, the American approach, but the Supreme Court, but they have taken a business substance over legal form approach to tax avoidance. I wonder what's going to happen in the years go forward, because the makeup of the court has changed significantly in the last, say, 5 years. And I don't have a handle on what the American, American tax law prof coming to your program. He might have a handle for that. It wouldn't surprise me if they shift back to a more legal form approach. That wouldn't surprise me. But at the same time, what about the Canadian situation? That's what my focus is on. What's going to happen here? I don't know. But I do know that the court has changed. The judges on the court are completely different than the judges. And when I read in the epilogue, I don't analyze them, but in the epilogue, I do refer to Alta Energy, Loblaw Financial, and Dean's Knight, which are 3 GAR cases, recent cases. I make comments about each one of them. And they're important cases, but I still have my own concerns about Dean Knight, even though the Crown won it. And the concern I have is that it still has this dysfunction. It still reflects that dysfunctional interpretive approach that we don't look to context and purpose much if it's just a regular income tax case. We only turn on the true contextual, textual, contextual purpose approach if it's a GAR case. That's dysfunctional. I could go on. I know. I sorry. I keep you from lunch. My God, you have an hour of report courses and like, oh, we're going to some class. I know. I hope it helps you in your careers because you're at the beginning of careers. They're good careers, and you're in a society that needs your expertise, and that's.
To have a critical thinking.
Yeah, critical thinking. Yeah, and realize the context and purpose. It's not just the text. Yeah. And when you go forward, that means you got to kind of think in terms. Well, will this case mean this 5 years out, 10 years? Especially if you're doing some planning. What's this going to mean planning wise? Because the planning occurs after some shift occurs that you never even were aware of.
Yeah, no, exactly. In your book, I read the book. I encourage you if you're interested. I will read it again and again because there's so many details in there, and it's you only got a glimpse of what's in the book. So really, thank you so much for sharing this and for your book.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Very interesting. Je vais laisser aussi les gens en ligne qui désirent nous quitter. On est rendu à l'heure un petit peu dépassée. Merci beaucoup. Merci à ceux qui ont été présents en personne. C'est toujours très intéressant pour un présentateur d'avoir des gens présentiels. Et tous nos gens aussi qui sont en ligne, qui se sont joints à nous pour la conférence. Si vous avez des questions par après, puis vous y pensez, vous n'hésitez pas à nous les poser, puis on les transfère aux conférenciers sans problème. Merci beaucoup. Donc, se termine pour la conférence d'aujourd'hui. La prochaine conférence, qui est une suite à la discussion qu'on avait à l'instant sur la substance économique. On va continuer à réfléchir à l'évitement le 22 mai prochain avec le professeur Aviona, le professeur Lyne et Rémi Gagnon, un expert aussi sur la question, qui vont venir nous instruire encore davantage sur cette question-là de substance économique dans les causes d'évitement fiscal. Pour le professeur Aviona sur le contexte américain, puis on va venir rejoindre ça avec le contexte canadien avec Lyne puis Rémi Gagnon. Donc, le 22 mai prochain, c'est une autre invitation à la veille du symposium André Laroux qui aura lieu aussi le 23, en fait, qui aura lieu aussi, mais le lendemain, le 23 mai à l'Université Laval, en présentiel. Donc, je vous invite à aller voir ces événements-là dont la promotion est faite sur le site de la chaire. Donc, merci beaucoup. Je quitte la présentation à l'instant.